And the question is, how can those of us who are committed to what's called interreligious or interfaith dialogue, help counter the negative effects of these things, not only in the United States, but wherever we find them. I think the most important thing for me, in my experience, has been the embodied encounter with the other. Abstract learning is very important, but one of the things about abstract learning that is a pitfall, really, is the temptation toward essentialism. Now, I'm kind of biased because I don't really have as much of a problem with positive essentialism as I do with negative essentialism. That is, when you're trying to appreciate another culture or another faith, and you find beautiful things in that other faith or other culture, and you essentialize and you say, that other culture is all about this beautiful thing or that beautiful thing. I guess I don't have a problem with that because, in a way, what you're doing is trying to reflect and express the aspirations of the real human beings who live in those cultures, who bear those faiths, and for whom those cultures and faiths are part of their lifeblood. Negative essentialism is quite a different story. Because what you're doing is actually the opposite. It's a profound betrayal of your fellow human being. Because it's the encounter of something that you perceive to be negative in that culture or faith, from your own limited understanding. And then, defining that as the essence of the culture. It's the very heart of all forms of bigotry, racism, prejudice, alienation, and demonization. And the remedy for it, generally, although it takes you have to have an open mind, but the remedy for it is actually meeting people, who are from these different cultures, from these different faith traditions, so that they can tell you what it is that they believe. So you can ask a Muslim, what is Islam for you? Etc. And so I think there's nothing that can replace that embodied encounter. And the more we make connections with one another in this regard, I think the better off we are. And then we also have to realize that there are people who, I guess this is one other piece of this, is that without knowing that this is an influence of secularization in some ways, and secular modernity, their religious identities are far more part of identity politics than they are part of an attempt to develop and grow spiritually. And this results in stripping down our various faith traditions into ideologies. And when you do that, you're actually gutting them, in a way. And we all do, and unfortunately I think some of the ways in which we teach our faith traditions to our children just plays into this whole dynamic of this is all about defining who you are against other people, and how much better you are than those other people who are not as good as you or don't understand things the way you do, etc. For me, this is a profound perversion of faith
because the way I understand the essence of so many faith traditions is to first of all affirm the dignity of all human persons, and to be a source of bringing people together in solidarity, not a way to divide people. So I think whenever we see people interpreting their religious traditions explicitly and expressly for the purposes of setting their fellow co-religionaries against others, I think we have to do all that we can to resist those interpretations within our own traditions. So in other words, to resist extremist, overly politicized interpretations of religion and religious identity in our own traditions.
Okay, now it's stated in the Quran that apart from the Muslims, the closest to God are the Christians. And it further states in the Quran that the Christians are devoted to knowledge and so on. it gives the utmost devotion to the Christians, to Jesus, to Mary. And as you stated, that there are more verses about Mary than there are in the Bible. And there's a chapter named after Mary. And the fact that Jesus is mentioned 25 times in the Quran, as opposed to Muhammad mentioned 5 times in the Quran, which is 500% mathematically speaking.
Although he's mentioned a lot with ka.
With ka, yes. Yes, you. Definitely, because God is revealing to him. And Moses is mentioned more than 100 times, 130 and so on.
Right.
So now, speaking about Jesus, speaking about Mary in the Quran, I would like to have an analytical question. What does the Bible, from your knowledge, does it say anything about Muhammad, who has guided people, today we have more than 1 billion followers, not of Muhammad but of Islam. And I have to clarify here, Muhammad is not the founder of Islam. He's a person who fulfills Islam, because Islam, as Muslims, we believe, was there since the dawn of time, since the dawn of men. And Adam was a Muslim, Jesus was a Muslim, because Islam itself means peace acquired by submitting your will to God. And as we know from John chapter 5, verse 30, that Jesus says that, for I do not seek to please my will, but the will of that God who has sent me. This shows that we Muslims we say that Jesus, Abraham, since all of the prophets from Adam to today to Muhammad, that all of them are Muslims. So does the Bible say anything about Muhammad? And I actually have another part of a question which will be answered.
Okay. From a Christian perspective, no, the Bible says nothing about Muhammad. Also, from a critical historical perspective, it doesn't, because it would be considered anachronistic. But of course, the critical historical perspective doesn't take into account prophecy and the idea that scriptures can actually have insight into things that happen in the future. So critical historical perspectives on scripture always say that what a scripture that took place or coalesced in a particular place in time knows is what was known in that place in time. But people of faith don't necessarily see things that way. There is a tradition in Islam of reading references to the Paraclete in the 4th Gospel, for instance in John 15, as references to the Prophet Muhammad. And Jesus says, I will send the advocate from my Father after me, who will dwell with you forever, this kind of thing. Now, this is a very complex dynamic, because, as the brother said, when from the Muslim perspective, Islam is not a religion originated by the Prophet Muhammad, but it's the original religion of humanity. So it's the religion of Adam. And of course there is a hadith that says every human being is born a Muslim with the fitrah of genuine submission to God, and insofar as they may not be living according to that fitrah, they've been socialized in a different direction. So then this is why many Muslims might use the concept of reversion to Islam instead of conversion. If someone, for instance, who is a Christian or a Buddhist or a Jew becomes a Muslim with a capital M, enters the Islamic faith with a capital I, then they're reverting to the original Islam with a little I, the original Muslim, the way they were hardwired by God spiritually and religiously. So what Islam then looks upon previous scriptures as being part of one continuum of revelation that reaches its apex in the Quranic revelation. And so it would be a very natural Islamic thing to look back into previous scriptural corpora for references to the Prophet Muhammad in precisely the same way as the authors of the New Testament mined the Hebrew scriptures for references to Jesus. I mean, this is exactly given that my own tradition, the scriptures of my own tradition, are produced by precisely that dynamic. Far be it from me to in any way have a problem with the fact that Muslims have sometimes read these references to the Paraclete, which is interpreted to be the Holy Spirit by Christians, as being references to Muhammad. The important thing to recognize in dialogue, though, is that Christians do not recognize those as references to the Prophet Muhammad. And I can say, even I don't. That's not because I'm probably, I don't, this may open myself to accusations of being an unorthodox Christian. That won't be the first time I'm subject to those accusations. But for me, Muhammad actually is a prophet in the sense that I believe in the divine inspiration of his mission, etc. And I believe the things I was sharing with you about the resonance of his sunnah, in my own life, as a Christian. But I don't believe that the references in the Johannine Gospel to the Paraclete are references to Muhammad, probably because of my historical critical approach to the Bible. And if you read the references to the Parakletos in the Johannine Gospel, in the whole Johannine corpus, in other words, you don't just pick them out of context, but you read them, you can see that in some ways, even from a Muslim perspective, they don't make a lot of sense. That, for instance, Muhammad will dwell within you forever. Well, this notion that Muhammad is going to dwell within people forever is not exactly a Muslim notion. So you actually have to really kind of pick some things out of context in order to make that interpretation work. But that's exactly what Jews would say about how some Christians have read, certain, for instance, the famous verse in Isaiah that says, and the virgin shall give birth to a child. The rabbinic interpretation of that is not the one the Christians imagined, that it's a prophetic foretelling of the virgin birth of Jesus. Because the Hebrew word just means young girl, not necessarily virgin, i.e. a young woman who has never had sexual intercourse. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things, that happen when we read each other's scriptures in order to somehow, understand, ourselves better, or to reinforce our faith in our own. I like to say to my Muslim friends about this issue that in terms of your conviction in the veracity of the mission of the Prophet, and even the Muslim conviction that he's the final messenger of the Quran, is the greatest revelation, the last thing you actually need to prove that are a few references in the Johannine Gospel, so it's not really a big issue ultimately. But it is important in dialogue to recognize the difference between how a Christian might read the Jewish scriptures and how a Jew reads the Jewish scriptures, how a Christian might read the New Testament, how a Muslim might read the New Testament.
Historically speaking, how do Christian theologians reflect on Prophet Muhammad? And if their reflections have been mainly negative, then what are the bases for that?
I mean, it begins with John of Damascus in the 8th century. He's one of the first Christian theologians to actually write on Islam. It's very early. He actually worked for the Umayyad dynasty. John of Damascus's grandfather, was the governor of Damascus when the Muslim forces conquered the Byzantine forces, and he negotiated the armistice with the Muslim forces. And then when the Muslims came in, they said, well, you're a good administrator, so you can work for us now. So he worked, and so his son, and then his grandson also. His grandson became a great doctor of the church, St. John of Damascus. And he wrote a treatise, a heresiography, in which he identified Islam as the 101st heresy. Now, you see, the reason he did this is because, from the Christian perspective, Islam is just not another religion to crop up. Because Islam, John of Damascus is very aware of the teachings of the Quran about Jesus, for instance. That Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, was the author of miracles. But also John of Damascus is aware that the Quran rejects this idea that Jesus is divine. And that even the Quran portrays Jesus as rejecting the idea that he is divine. So by that time, that is a teaching that goes against Orthodox Christian understanding of Jesus, although there were low Christian Christologies earlier on that had eventually been sort of weeded out and declared heresies. So John says, well, this is another kind of Christological heresy coming out of Arabia. Maybe Muhammad was schooled by an Arian monk, because Arius had a lower Christology than the Christology that became Orthodox, fully God and fully man, Jesus being fully God and fully man. and then he refers not to Muhammad, but refers to kind of the coming of Islam as kind of the precursor to the coming of the Antichrist, principally because what's happening is the lands of Christendom are receding now, as Islam is beginning to spread and become a successful religio-political force in the ancient Mediterranean world. And so as a Christian, he sees this as the beginning maybe of the end, because, like, you know, there's deterioration now of Christendom. So, I mean, that might not be so great. It's not very rosy in terms of its depiction of Islam. But then later you start to get so John of Damascus doesn't demonize the Prophet Muhammad per se. But later you start to get these demonizations. If Islam is a heresy, right, then who's the arch heretic? Astaghfirullah. Right? The arch heretic is the founder of Islam. Those Christians would not see Islam to be these Christians' original religion. They would say it's a religion started by this guy, and this guy is saying that these words he's getting that are denying the truth we know about Jesus and the truth we know, and it says it's the final revelation when we know Jesus is the final revelation. He says he's getting it directly from God. So, he's either a lunatic or a liar. And so these two, you know, that's a great option. You know, the great prophet of Islam is either a lunatic or a liar, and basically the latter was what people gravitated towards. You know, that this is some kind of diabolical plot, and then you have, you know, this fixation on Islam and violence, simply because of the military success of the Islamic polity. I mean, the Muslims are just playing the game that all the imperiums were played. You know, you just spread, you try to get as much land as possible and spread your influence. The Christians did the same thing. It's nothing sort of out of the ordinary. But because the Christians were now on the receiving end of some of that conquest, they were really looking, you know, at Islam as violent, you know, because it was spreading its message by the sword. Not really. I mean, Muslims were establishing political hegemony over wide swaths of the ancient world by military conquest, but there was no forced conversion to Islam. In fact, you know, you could tax every non-Muslim living in your realm, and so there was a financial disincentive not to forcefully convert people to Islam. There have been studies that show that mass conversion to Islam occurred over about a 3-century period at different rates in different parts of the Muslim world for a variety of different interesting sociological reasons. You know, but this idea of the fixation on violence, and then for Christians especially, you see, because what developed in Christianity was this idea of celibacy as a spiritual ideal. Not unlike the role that it plays in Buddhism. It's a lot of differences, but analogous. The idea that Jesus was celibate, Jesus didn't marry, so the perfection of one's spirituality comes in a kind of sacrifice of one's sexuality, or a gift of one's sexuality to God. Instead of, nothing wrong with sex, nothing wrong with getting married, but it doesn't embody spiritual perfection. Okay? As a very Christian, heavily influenced by Greek ideas of a kind of disembodied, immaterial, Platonian, Neoplatonian spirituality where you try to escape the material to become more spiritual. Not very Semitic, really. Not very Jewish, not very Muslim. And here's Muhammad, you know, marrying and, you know, having children and, you know, etc. So having an active sex life. And so what does that look like from a Christian perspective? He's the lying sex maniac, you know, who's violent. It's all of the, you know, it's the boogeyman, you know, come true. And that's what you do. You generally project onto someone or something you're afraid of, something that presents a threat to you. Again, it's this negative essentialism. You pick out something that seems negative to you. It might not be negative in its original context at all if you try to understand it in its original. It seems negative to you, and then you exaggerate it. And these stereotypes, you know, which emerged pretty early on, you know, 9th century, 10th century, and especially in the West, you know, are still with us today. And if you can go on the internet, and you still see them there. Islam is violent, oppresses women. This is part of that whole sexuality thing. It's deceptive. It's all a big lie. There's a new book, Islam is not a religion, something like this. You hear people now say this. So this is an attempt to say you don't have to accord Islam the respect you accord to other religions, because it's actually a diabolical movement of conquest, designed to sort of conquer the world and subjugate the world, in this kind of way. So
we are far away from where the Prophet stood in the past. Like, our Prophet once got some wisdom from church with the Christian people. They came to their mosque and they talked and they get some information from our Prophet. And after that, the Christian people said, "Can I pray in your mosque?" And our Prophet left the mosque to them. But today, we cannot do this. So what would you think? I mean, maybe the Moses or Jesus Christ and our Prophet lived in this time. What do they do for the world peace?
Well, imagined the institutions that their missions ended up generating. Now, institutions are an important dimension of the life of any religion. As Houston Smith, the great scholar of religion, says, without the institution of the church, the Christian church, the Sermon on the Mount would have evaporated into thin air. Without Islamic institutions, without building mosques and madrasas, and without the rituals of memorizing the Quran and passing on the Hadith and establishing a whole system of religious learning in order to interpret God's law, fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, etc. The message of the Quran, would have easily. So institutions are a vital and necessary part of human social organization and human social life, and certainly of religions. The problem is when the institutions become an end in themselves, and not what they were designed to do, which is a means of conveying the message. And also, when we as human beings don't realize that these institutional dimensions of our religious traditions are profoundly historical, meaning they have developed in history. There are many Catholics who think that, Jesus died on Good Friday, rose on Easter Sunday, and then all the disciples went to the Vatican on Easter Monday and had Mass. That they basically, that there were churches there, or that Jesus was Catholic, something like this. They don't realize that the institutional dimensions of their faith that they experience grew and developed in history as their faith community was seeking to continue to be faithful to the message that Jesus taught. And so, once we begin to idolize our institutions, that's all part of this problem of looking at our faith traditions as part of our identities, and therefore wanting to use our faith traditions as a power leverage in our relationships with others. No, you can't come here because you're not this, or you can't do this, or whatever. Instead of recognizing that these institutions are there so that we can go very deeply into the most profound and foundational elements of our faith teachings. And when we look at those most profound elements, they're very, very challenging. They're all about recognizing the dignity of other human beings. They're all about serving the poor. They're all about, but no one wants to talk about this because, market capitalism, is a huge problem from the perspective of almost every major religious tradition in the world. Yet, the practitioners of almost every major religious tradition in the world, in one way, are either the victims of or have completely bought into market capitalism, and I don't accept myself from that analysis. So, these are the problems that we really need to be thinking about, violence, hunger, poverty, disease, of all kinds. These are the enemies of humanity, not our fellow human beings who practice other faiths. And I think that perhaps this is where we can, as people committed to interreligious dialogue, begin to better understand each other so that we can identify what our common values are and where we can work together in solidarity with one another for the common good. We can do that.
So much about understanding each other, about interfaith communication, relation, and building up that understanding. So have there been, or are there any sound examples of those interfaith movements and that we are aware of, or you can give an example of and share with us?
There's no one-size-fits-all. It is a global movement in a way, and we can learn a lot from one another, and we should. And that's the reason why, it's kind of like the bumper sticker, think globally, act locally, I mean, there is a profound global dimension to all of this, but we have to realize that it doesn't start in big international conferences and end there. It could be inspired by an international conference, but it really needs to start and end in one's own neighborhood, in one's own family, etc. There are. The list doesn't end. I just name a few things. There's something called the Interfaith Youth Corps, okay, which is got its headquarters in Chicago. The founder of the Interfaith Youth Corps is a man by the name of pbuh Patel. He's a U.S. American Muslim. He's written a book called Acts of Faith, if you're interested in reading this. His vision is to bring young people, he defines young people very broadly, basically late secondary school through college and even like into your 30s, like early 30s. Bring young people together from various faith traditions around social service projects. So that they can together realize what it is about each other's traditions that motivates them to work for the common good. And Interfaith Youth Corps has been very successful on many college and university campuses in the United States. It's really primarily right now a U.S. American phenomenon, but they have done things in Jordan and in Indonesia, and I think pbuh is trying to seed this movement, but obviously to work in different cultural contexts, it really needs to enculturate and be received and transformed in meaningful ways by the local cultures. The Catholic Church, for all its faults and flaws and shortcomings in terms of interreligious dialogue, there's a Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue at the Vatican at the highest level. And many dioceses, the Catholic Church is organized into things called dioceses, jurisdictions that have bishops as their heads, have offices for interreligious affairs or dialogue. In places, especially where there's a lot of conflict, like Indonesia, Mindanao, Nigeria, where there have been significant conflicts between Muslims and Christians. We hear about them in the news. There's more than the energy in the conflicts, which is what we hear about in the media. There are people working assiduously to resolve and transform those conflicts, in the context of interreligious dialogue. Two friends of mine, Matthew Kuka, who's the he's a priest, Catholic priest, primary interreligious officer for the Diocese of Abuja in Nigeria. In Ishaq Olayede, who's the professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Ilorin University in Nigeria. And they're very, very close friends. And they work a lot. They work with NGOs, and they have a lot of people working with them. You don't hear about, what you hear about in the media is when, because of political circumstances and justice issues, violence erupts and some Christians burn a mosque or Muslims burn a church or something like this. What you don't hear are the stories of a young Muslim man in Indonesia who hears about a bomb that a radical has planted in a Christian church on Christmas Eve. And Indonesia is a predominantly Muslim country. The Christians are a minority. He goes into this Catholic church to get the bomb out. He brings the bomb out, and in bringing the bomb out, it blows up and he dies. So it's a story that needs to be on the front page of the New York Times, given how much stuff about Muslims blowing themselves up to kill other people is on the front page of the New York Times. To realize that most Muslims share the sentiment and perspective of this young man. Hizmet, this Turkish organization, to give a Muslim example, is doing marvelous things, in various parts of the world. I know the U.S.-American context the best. In 2003, they started working in Chicago, Turkish Muslim group, to try to bring people together, interfaith service projects, other kinds of things, mutual understanding programs of all sorts. In a few short years, they became one of the leading institutions in Chicago in the area of interfaith dialogue and interfaith relations. And they facilitated educational programs in the public schools for interfaith dialogue, sort of to help public schools do that. This is a Turkish Muslim organization that's doing this. I'll stop by just making reference to the Common Word initiative. This is less of a grassroots, more of a high level thing. But the Royal Al Bayt Institute in Amman, in Jordan, that's headed up by Prince Ghazi, back in 2007, issued a statement called A Common Word. If you Google acommonword.com, all one word, you can go to their website and read the document in a number of different languages. And it's signed originally by 138 Muslim scholars from around the world, but subsequently many thousands of other Muslim leaders and scholars from around the world have signed on, and then non-Muslims have kind of signed it as endorsers. And it's a statement about the centrality of the two commandments of love of God and love of neighbor in Islam, and a call based on a particular Quranic verse for Muslims and Christians and people of other faith to come together for purposes of mutual understanding. And they've been sponsoring a number of higher level dialogues that have been going on, particularly one with the Vatican. That's kind of ongoing between a group of Muslim scholars from around the world and a group of Catholic scholars from around the world. So it's happening at the grassroots level. It's happening, at the high level. It needs more. There can't be enough. And if your question is, what can I do if you're not already doing a lot? First, I want to thank you for being here, because being here for a conversation like this is all part of sort of being involved in this movement. But unfortunately, I can't tell you what you can do. Only you can answer that question for yourself. But there is an answer. If you look for it, you'll find it.